So we've talked about implicit bias and racial anxiety as two phenomena that even in environments with well-intentioned people, all of whom have the goal of belonging, who want both people they work with and people who they serve, again, within the Park Service, to feel as though they're entirely welcomed and belong, there are challenges, and implicit bias and racial anxiety are two of the three. Within workplaces, and to some degree, even among people who are visiting the parks, stereotype threat is a third phenomena that may come into play that it's crucial to be aware of and to begin to work to protect against. Stereotype threat is the phenomena that occurs when a negative stereotype about our group is triggered. The effect is it increases our anxiety, can even lead to failures of self-regulation, performance that's impaired, or even in some instances aggressive behavior, because the power of that stereotype about us can play a role in the way our brain is processing the experience. So the image you have before you is of an African-American woman, and there are a host of negative images and stereotypes about Black women that they're aware of. The idea, the assumption that they're poor, the assumption that they can be angry, threatening, or intimidating, they're overly emotional, that they are intellectually inferior. These are negative, pernicious stereotypes that, again, consciously we reject, but are in the culture and people are experiencing them and they have an effect. How do they show up? They're literally showing up physiologically. Our brains, when we're experiencing stereotype threat, are diverting sort of brain energy, cognitive energy, away from the task at hand if we're in a work environment and toward managing and trying to suppress that emotion. Our heart rates increase, our blood pressure rises, and the way that we regulate emotion can go into overdrive because we're trying to self-monitor, to suppress and push down that self-doubt. We're focusing on disproving this idea that our group has this negative reputation, and we go out of our way to avoid failure. And oftentimes, the people who will be encountering, even if they're experiencing stereotype threat, they're managing it. But they're managing it as a huge obstacle. We sometimes use the analogy of a race where all the runners are very well conditioned and most of the runners have the wind at their back, but some runners are running into a headwind. That's what stereotype threat is like. And it can be managed, but when a task is particularly complex, when it requires all of our cognitive capacities, all of our potential to be realized, that's when stereotype threat can get in the way. And in some sense, the sort of the sad irony about stereotype threat is it tends to be most acute when we care about whatever the area is most. So if a woman is a mathematician or sort of math is her area of expertise, she's giving a presentation and it's in front of a mixed group, so her identity as a woman is irrelevant, she's great, she's fantastic, she does complex math in her head and she's wonderful. Let's imagine a scenario where she's in a room of all men and the negative stereotype about women and math kicks in. Suddenly, part of her cognitive energies are going into managing that stereotype, and so she may not be as effective in her presentation. She may make small mistakes in her math that she would never otherwise make. Now, needless to say, not everyone from every group is what we call vulnerable to stereotype threat, but enough of us are that it's something that within an institution or a workplace to ensure that everyone can be their best selves and to ensure that some of the employees are not essentially having to work twice as hard to be equally good, we want to do everything we can to prevent stereotype threat from being triggered. And stereotype threat can be triggered about people in any group. So let's use the example of white men who are generally assumed to be in the dominant group, and so these issues don't affect them. Studies done at Stanford showed that white male math majors did less well in difficult calculus tests if they had Asian Americans near them, because there's a stereotype that Asian Americans are better at math. So again, this is not something that's unique to those of us who fit into what's perceived as a non-dominant group. It can happen to anybody. There's one interesting study that was done with white men and black men and golf putting. And so and I don't know if any of you are golfers, but putting is often sort of this small task, but very important one. And so some group of the men were told that effectively putting the golf ball into the hole was a result of, it was a study of their spatial capacities and their spatial abilities. And so the white men did very well when they thought this was about their spatial abilities. When similar cohort of white men, none of whom were golfers, paired with black men, and they were all told this was a test of your natural athletic ability, the white men did far less well. So again, the stereotypes here can affect any of us from any group depending upon what those stereotypes are. There's a powerful stereotype, and this is linked to racial anxiety, that for those of us who are white is among the stereotypes we're most concerned about having attributed to us, and that's that we're racist. So the idea that we might be perceived as racist, if that's coming into effect, can result in us taking steps to prevent that stereotype from being applied that it turns out actually aren't helpful. So for example, studies done of middle school teachers who are given writing and asked to evaluate the writing, if a teacher is worried that she's going to be perceived as racist, she may give overly positive feedback. Or peer counselors in the college setting, when they're told that they should be recommending to different students whether or not it's a good idea to take a particular set of courses, let's say organic chemistry and calculus in the same semester if you want to be a medical student and go into medical school, the peer counselors will tell white and Asian American students, don't take those two courses at the same time. They're both really difficult. Take them in different semesters. But the peer counselors often will not give that same sound advice to Black or Latino students because they don't want to seem racist. So ironically, there's a way in which, in this instance, a stereotype about being racist can lead people to make decisions that they think are helpful, that they think are kind, that they think are supportive, that actually aren't helpful or consistent. And so this is something for those of us who are in supervisory positions, we have to take this seriously, not giving people of color critical feedback as a way of showing that we're not racist isn't helpful. And I'll talk about ways around that in a little bit. The experience of feeling stereotype threat, the experience of feeling like what you say isn't listened to, and the feeling that it might be because of your identity group, because you're female in a male setting, because you're a person of color in a predominantly white setting, whatever the identity group may be, can lead to disengagement, not because you don't want to be engaged, but actually because you feel as though your contributions aren't valued, and it's a safer place to essentially try and prevent yourself from caring as much as you do. So in an institutional environment, preventing against stereotype threat, ensuring that people don't feel like their identity group makes them suspect is critical to ensuring that people are at their best. This is an image that we identified to show a study about the challenges of being the single person of a particular group. And we, of course, thought the eggs were a good image just to lighten things up a little bit. But it's a powerful phenomenon, actually. So to be the only member of your particular group puts all the burden on you to essentially represent for your group. So again, it's a way that stereotype threat is often triggered if you're the person and the only person from your group. In the context of healthcare, and again, much of the studies I'm sharing with you are from healthcare, and the reason that I do is because a lot of the work is done in healthcare, and so what we can do in thinking about how this applies to the National Park Service is to think about what the analogies are. What's important to understand about how stereotype threat is triggered in healthcare is it's the experience of the patient being aware of stereotypes about them and the effect that that has on the patient. And so look carefully at some of the implications of patients worrying about healthcare providers having negative stereotypes about them. They avoid healthcare. They don't have as good communication with their providers. They don't adhere to treatment plans. They discount feedback. They disidentify with health promotion as white. How might this apply to the National Park Service? Well, among the big challenges the park is facing is why don't people from some groups go to some national parks? Right? Why is it less likely that African Americans or Latinos are visiting some of the national parks? That may be a form of avoidance. If people don't feel like they're welcome, and because they think that they're going to be seen in a certain way, avoidance is a response to that. Disidentifying with health promotion behaviors as white, seeing going to the national parks as quote-unquote white, that's something that's been discussed within the Park Service as one of the challenges. So one of the goals may be, for purposes of bringing more people into the Park Service, to think about whether there's a way in which stereotypes about groups are being triggered either by images or by the way that people are treated. Again, often completely unintentionally by Park Service employees when they're invited into parks. So all this is something that's clearly being taken into account by some of the really fantastic promotional work that's being done by the Park Service, but it's something that individual members can think about too. Am I ensuring that when I interact with people as they visit the parks, that I'm doing so in a way that's respectful, that's open, and that's warm, and so they feel like they're welcome here? So again, what are the solutions? These should be somewhat familiar because they're similar to the solutions for racial anxiety. Creating an environment that's identity safe. What does that mean in the context of the Park Service? This is obviously something where there's a lot of thought going on within the Park Service. How do we structure parks so that there aren't some groups who feel like whatever their identity is, it's excluded, or somehow some part of their identity is being seen as negative or problematic? And again, I know a lot of thinking about this is going on within the Park Service, and thinking about how individual members of the Park Service can respond is also important. Feelings of social belonging. This is something that can happen within the workforce as well as in thinking about how to welcome in members of the public. Encouraging self-affirmation. This is something that would be more attributable to the workforce, because what this intervention involves is helping people think about why they're in a particular place and what value it serves beyond themselves. What are the values that are consistent with their ideals for community? What are the values that are consistent with who they are as people? And so helping people think, who are working within the Park Service, to think about, how am I serving my community by working here? How am I part of something bigger than myself? That can actually be very effective in sort of de-triggering the concerns about how they're perceived as an individual, and allowing us to focus on these broader values and shared aspirations. Removing triggers for stereotype threat. What might that be? If in any particular workforce, all of the images in that workforce show people of a particular group and exclude some people, that can be a trigger for stereotype threat. So literally the images around us can make a difference. There was a study done for women giving speeches. And if they were giving speeches in a room that had images all of people, of males, they were less likely to be very facile and and comfortable and eloquent in their speeches than if there were pictures of people that included women. This idea of a growth mindset, I've mentioned a couple of different times, but what this means is not thinking of wherever we are as where we'll stay. So if there are longtime employees who haven't necessarily been seen as stars, making sure that everybody knows that they have the capacity to grow, that the Park Service recognizes that, and creating an environment in which, again, past behavior isn't seen as a determiner of how you'll be perceived or valued going forward. And finally, and I'm going to talk more about this, in the supervisor-supervisory relationship, ensuring that feedback is given in a way that's trusted and motivating. So the feedback is neither understood to be biased and overly critical because of someone's identity group, or, and this can be a problem for those of us, and I frankly count myself as someone who inadvertently engaged in this, those of us who care a lot about these issues, we can often think that being kind, giving lots of praise, is a way of being supportive and non-racist. But actually, if we're always giving praise and always being kind, people don't trust our praise as being particularly meaningful. So there's a form of feedback to prevent against stereotype threat called wise feedback. And what it involves is not just giving pure criticism. And you can see on the table in front of you, just giving people cross-racial pure criticism can lead, in this instance, Black students from Stanford to worry that the criticism is critical because of bias. And so on the left, you can see what's being measured here is the motivation to complete the task. In this case, the task was to revise an essay. So the motivation for the Black students when they just got criticism was very low, undoubtedly because of concern that the criticism was a result of bias. When the person providing the criticism, and this was in writing, included praise along with the criticism, that helped. That made a profound change from just the pure criticism. But when we see an additional two elements, not just praise, but in the third sort of segment where there's the invocation of high standards. I'm a person who demands excellence, who expects excellence. And then the assurance specifically of the particular individual's capacity to meet those standards, and then the criticism. In this instance, the Black students' motivation to complete the task was extremely high. And when we see the effects of the criticism plus high standards plus assurance and the scores in the revised essays, there's virtually no difference between the Black students and the white students. And you can see in the lighter blue on the left, when there was just criticism, the white students' scores were far higher because the Black students were, again, undoubtedly less engaged. So giving wise feedback is something that can be done in the context of a supervisory relationship and done by again, creating an atmosphere in which a supervisor is seen as someone who's fair, who's someone who expects excellence in the most positive way because of the incredible importance of the tasks and the work that you're all involved in, and who gives feedback so that they are individually recognizing what people's capacities are, and that, of course, requires supervisors to get to know the people they're working with, and that has, positive implications for all the phenomena we've talked about. For implicit bias, getting to know the people you're working with is a form of individuation that reduces bias. Getting to know people helps to reduce racial anxiety, and finally, looking for people's strengths so that you can link what you see in them to the excellence that you expect, but also knowing that providing people critical feedback is necessary for their growth, it has a really positive and powerful effect on people's ability to do their best work. So if you combine the work that can be done to override or to some extent reduce our implicit biases, the work that can be done to modify or ameliorate the anxiety that we can feel in cross-racial interaction, and the work that can be done to de-trigger or prevent against stereotype threat can be really powerful both in the work climate of the National Park Service and in the interactions with individuals who are coming to the park or families or groups who are coming to the park. And finally, one of the final challenges that the Park Service, like every other institution, faces is how do we talk about race? And my final set of recommendations from the science would be, when thinking about grappling with issues of race and other kinds of identity differences, think about the assets, think about the benefits, think about the strengths that can be derived from creating inclusive and strong and diverse environments both within the workplace and within those who visit the parks. And if we think about all the benefits of that, instead of seeing race and ethnicity as sort of problems to be solved, that can change the way the emotion and the attitude we bring to the work and make it something that essentially we can celebrate ourselves while we're doing it, as opposed to thinking of ourselves as engaging in an intractable burden that can never be successfully achieved. Because the social science offers some profound tools and insights, the motivation that obviously exists within the Park Service, the leadership that you have. So when you combine all of that, you have an enormous capacity for, sort of bringing the wonders of the parks to everyone and having everyone who works in the Park Service feel like they're part of that journey. Thank you all so much. I hope this was helpful.